Thank you for the opportunity to present my vision of an enterprise architecture approach to strategic change in the FRCA. There are a number of enterprise architecture methodologies available, although currently the market is dominated by four main methodologies. These are the Open Group Architecture Framework, which takes up about 80% of the market, the Zachman Framework, which uses a methodology of taxonomy to group materials and documents into like-minded baskets, the Federal Enterprise Architecture Framework, which was developed by the U.S. federal government for use in the U.S. federal government. This uses a combination of TOGAF and Zachman approaches. And finally, the Gartner practice, which is a proprietary process used by one of the leading IT consultancies in the world, Gartner Incorporated. The framework I am most familiar with is the TOGAF framework. I have not been lucky enough to work for an organization that has had the size, the vision, or the budget to fully implement an enterprise solution. Really less than a handful of organizations in Fiji have the capacity to do so, USP being the only one that comes to mind. An enterprise solution is not something that many organizations can afford to invest in. That being said, the TOGAF framework was the framework I used to structure and inform my approach to the IT solution I recommended for the Fiji Higher Education Commission in 2017. At the Commission, I was in the process of implementing a Microsoft Dynamics 365 solution for their needs. Really, the best things about the TOGAF framework is, one, it is vendor neutral, so you're not forced to choose solutions from specific vendors, and ultimately your final solution can consist of a multitude of tailor-made products. The framework methodology is also open sourced, so there's a lot of online materials and self-help content available. The framework, as I mentioned earlier, is very widely used. 80% of the practitioners use this framework. This goes a long way towards providing the organization with some continuity assurance if they lose people due to turnover. TOGAF is a step-by-step process, so it makes logical sense to my personal thought process and my organizational approach. For instance, the architecture vision feeds into the business architecture, which in turn feeds into the systems architecture, and then allows you to describe your technology architecture, which ultimately provides you with candidates for software solutions. This is a logical step-by-step process, interrelated and interdependent. However, like anything else in life, TOGAF is not perfect. There are some weaknesses in the methodology, which perhaps are better handled by some of the other methodologies. One of the key issues with TOGAF is that it is a huge and complex methodology, and it's rife with special terminology and contractions that can make it intimidating to the uninitiated. But in all honesty, none of the enterprise architecture methodologies are simple, and TOGAF is not an exception to that. TOGAF is also procedurally bounded. The step-by-step approach, which is a strength, is also a weakness, in that you must begin the process from stage one. And while it does allow for some iteration, mistakes in earlier steps can have far-reaching implications due to the closely interrelated and interdependent nature of the steps in the methodology. Finally, TOGAF is focused specifically on the enterprise or the organization itself. It does not really cover, for instance, the vendors or the stakeholders outside of the organization. This issue is easily mitigated with some forethought and planning in the scoping process. For instance, you ensure the interoperability specifications in outward-facing applications and solutions are built for interoperability. Now for my suggested plan for the first 12 months. I firmly believe in the old tailor's or the carpenter's adage, measure twice, cut once. This is an old saying that stresses the importance of forethought and planning. Ensure your measurements before you make any cuts. The first phase will produce a number of documents which will work to define the enterprise, identify key drivers, clearly scope the requirements, look at the principles by which the architecture will operate. It'll define very clearly the framework that will be used. It'll also look at the relationship between the management frameworks which are used to govern the architecture. And we'll also, in this first stage, evaluate the maturity of the architecture as it currently stands. In essence, the first phase will focus purely on understanding the FRCA, clearly defining the nature of the FRCA, its current capacity, where the gaps lie, and ultimately what its future objectives and goals are. The preliminary process will produce some very important documents that will become Bible, or the holy book for the change process going forward. In particular, key outputs from this process will be the scope of impact, which identifies who are stakeholders, which parts of the organization will be affected by the changes, who benefits the most, who's not really impacted, what kind of legal frameworks the architecture might operate under. Do we have one? Do we need to make one? We will also be able to provide a maturity assessment to determine the existing enterprise and business capabilities, as well as a gaps in resolution approach. The idea is to determine what kind of systems we currently have, how well are they doing their job, where are the gaps, how do we approach filling those gaps. We'll also be determining the roles and responsibilities, particularly identifying the sponsors and the champions, which business units have ownership of which processes. Also in the preliminary process, we identify the constraints on the architecture which may limit our plans going forward. How much will this cost us? And finally, what is our governance and support framework? In essence, the first phase of the process will be the messiest. It will be convoluted and confusing, and will highlight many embarrassing facets of the organization. But ultimately, if done well, it will provide a cohesive vision for the future of the FRCA. The next steps after the preliminary phases will be to implement the ADM cycle, which is the core of the TOGAF method, and is what you might expect to be more traditional IT work, where we'll look at actual solutions, opportunities, migration planning, change management, implementation, government, and so on and so forth. The preliminary process, however, is critical to ensuring that the next steps can be conducted in a timely and efficient manner. Thank you for the opportunity. Do you have any questions?